This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you, Charlotte. I was just about to say, can you press record? So as always, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available online afterwards, and the slides, I will circulate the slides straight after the webinar. We circulate them as PDFs, so I know that some of you use them for internal briefings, or you want to pluck slides off them. If you want a PowerPoint version, which is obviously much easier to play with, you can get that by clicking on the link that will take you to our OneDrive, or just email us and we'll send you them directly. The whole point of this is about disseminating information as quickly and efficiently as possible. So please feel free to just email us. Can we go to the first slide, please, Charlotte? So here we have the COVID group today. We had a huge increase in numbers of organisations over the last week. And that's partly driven by the fact there was a bit of press that happened last week, but we've leapt from 190 organisations to 261, and you can see how that's scattered around the world. I think I joked last week that we didn't have anyone from Japan or Russia. Well, we've ticked the Japan box. We still haven't quite ticked the Russia box yet, though. And world domination is important to me, so that's what we're going to try and focus on this week. So the group's growing and it's effective. I'd like to just start with this, which was shared or published by the IHE Delft, which you probably can't read the detail, but when you get the presentation, it's worth looking at this. It's 12 facts about COVID, which are really worth knowing, and everyone in the water sector should know them, and we should be sharing them with the public. It's brutally honest, as you'd expect anything from the Dutch to be, and it sort of gives reassurance. It's phrased in a way that gives good reassurance around things. For example, the virus is difficult to cultivate from stools, and that the presence of COVID-19 in raw water courses and reservoirs is very unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely, and it's a really good image, and it has sort of been going viral, if you'll forgive the joke, a bit online, so you may have seen it from other sources, but we thought we'd share that. And then if we can jump to the next slide. So the things are, Charlotte's now got the interesting fun here where you click for the next slide and it takes 10 seconds for it to come through. So there are 4 things I'm going to talk about today, a couple of minutes on each. There's what's happening now as we think about exiting lockdown in some countries. Of course, lots of countries are still going into it rather than exiting. I'll pick up some of the questions that have been raised by the group. I'll touch on the utilities survey, and I'll give you an update on the technology outreach project. And then there's the usual stuff on pending questions and resources at the end, which we'll skip through. So on exiting lockdown, you might recall that last week we produced a couple of slides that summarize where each of the countries were in their lockdown process. When had they started the lockdown? When were they thinking of coming out of it? And we've actually updated that table, and it's in the appendix of this slide deck. But that's not really what we want. What we want to know is what are the utilities doing, not what the countries are doing, because that's sort of divorced from it. And this is the point around, we know we're in a marathon. What we don't know is whether we're at mile 2 or mile 20. And different countries are doing different things. So in Europe, there's a couple of countries, Italy and Spain, which were the first to be hit by the pandemic, are now the first ones to be easing their way out of it. In Singapore, they were very tight on locking down. They thought they'd nailed it. They eased off, and then they've had a resurgence, and actually this week they've launched something called the circuit breaker, which is an incredibly tight lockdown now in Singapore, much tighter than what they did before in an effort to tackle the resurgence. Obviously in the United States, which is the bulk of the audience on this webinar, there's a national debate going on around the lockdown measures, which I won't get drawn into. What we're seeing is that when it's easing off, it's being done in phases. And what we'd like to do is get into the question of, well, what are different utilities doing? Because I think this is where it's going to become really important for us on this webinar, as we've gone through this process of learning out how we mobilize into the lockdown. What we do as we come out becomes important. As you probably know, we do this webinar twice. We do it in the morning and in the afternoon UK time. And after the morning one, we've actually had some feedback on this, which we'll be sharing on next week's session. Can we flick to the next slide? It is worth remembering that not everybody is exiting, and in the case of Mexico, There's sort of some confusion there, I think, between what the federal government and the state governments are doing. And these are my words, not anyone else's. We've actually not attributed this slide to anyone, although it was drawn from feedback from a few sources. There's what I think is questionable political leadership with a president who seems to think that his moral code has made him resistant to the virus. And what's interesting here is seeing what the water ministry is doing. They're giving 5,000 litres a month to households to help them move forward. And so we've got certain places, and it's just a reminder that some countries are still working their way through the early stages of this pandemic. You can go to the next slide. And what we'll see on the next slide when it appears is the burden of disease, where the deaths are coming. Now, this is really interesting because you can see that there's sort of 4 countries which cover almost 3/4 of the deaths that we've seen. Now, that either means that the other countries have done incredibly well on locking down, or actually they just haven't seen the bad news yet. They're yet to experience it. So we really don't know whether this is mile 2 or mile 20 of the marathon, and different people have started the race at different times. So I think all of this is about trying to capture that learning. So that's part 1. Part 2 is to refer to the questions that have come in from over the week. There are 4 which we focused on here. The first one was around the cessation of sludge recycling and spreading of sewage sludges to land. There seem to be 3 places in the world where this was an issue: in the Middle East, in Oman, in France, and there's a petition from the governor of Virginia to look at what they might do around their region. I think the feedback that came from it was that, well, there is no evidence that the virus is surviving in sludges, and the best you could say is that the precautionary principles being applied. That what people are doing is that they're saying, well, we don't know, so let's err on the side of caution. I think that's the nicest way of viewing it. My gut says that I think there's probably some hidden agendas that are being played out here with various people and organizations who are trying to use the virus to maybe exercise their own perspectives on things. So it's one to watch. It's suddenly blossomed up as an area of concern in more than one place. You can go to the next slide. The second question was around demand prediction and change in demand patterns. Now, I know that this audience is changing week on week because more people are joining, but this has been a recurring theme on these webinars. And in previous webinars, very early on, we spotted that there seemed to be a big shift in how people were using their water. And it was really that the peak was no longer happening at 7 to 8 a.m. in the morning, but had moved to 10 to 11 a.m. And basically, when people are working from home and they're not having to commute, no shit, Sherlock, they're staying in bed for a bit later and getting up and enjoying their mornings better. That has been confirmed by more studies that have been undertaken. And in particular, I like this one from Germany, where they're so German and so precise, isn't it beautiful, that their morning demand peak has shifted to around 9:40 in the morning. It's just marvelous that they've been so precise. And so we're seeing that is moving, and that is now that shift in peak, and how we change our operational practices to match that with our water outputs is obviously becoming an issue for water utilities to keep in mind. If we flick to the next slide, then the remaining 10 seconds I've got here. Oh, no, moved quickly that time. The further evidence for that was that in the evenings, the water consumption hasn't changed. Changes in water consumption patterns, that question number 2 then leads on to changes in consumption patterns. And there's been quite a lot of debate that we've had over the last few weeks around this, which is generally shown as a broad message. Broadly, domestic use is going up because people are spending more time at home. Commercial, industrial, non-domestic use is going down because industry is essentially greatly shut down. And broadly, it appears that the amount of domestic use that's gone up is in the 15 to 25% range, and broadly the amount of decrease in industry is in the 25 to 50% range. Now, for utilities, that becomes quite useful, because if you know how much of your demographic is industrial and how much is domestic, you can maybe start predicting what this is going to mean for your your supply and what it also means for your revenues. There's some interesting twists in here. So there was a note there, don't bother going back. There was a note there that from Las Vegas around, well, they've seen a drop in their water usage, but actually that's come from the cooler, wetter weather as much as from anything else. There's also the chat. Okay, we move on now, thanks. Apologies for those of you who arrived late. I'm not driving the slides. My computer is struggling, so Charlotte's driving the slides for me. As I like to include this because Adrian Cronin very kindly from Irish Water very kindly has been sharing data on his personal water usage. And I joked last week that we had one data point. Well, I'm pleased to report that this week we have had 100% increase in our data points, and we now have 2. And it's continuing to support this idea. I think the idea of the Cronin experiment, it sounds like a film. And so at some point in the future, we will be making a film of the WhatsApp group, and I intend to be played by Brad Pitt, obviously. What we've seen in the data here, it's been great weather, and Adrian's family have used more water than expected. Joking aside, what this is confirming is that domestic use is higher than average. And Adrian, if you're on this webinar, thank you for continuing to register your data. We want to continue seeing it. The last question to touch on is one that's actually caught quite a lot of attention today, and is around the presence of COVID-19 in the non-potable water network. Now, this started, and I think that, one of the reasons we've got to know about this is because I think these are the sorts of things that the media, the mass media, sort of grab hold of and they manipulate to tell stories which aren't necessarily fixed on the science. And we've got to be clear about that. There's been some data that came out of the non-potable network in Paris, which showed that maybe there were virus traces there. And that then led to people saying, hang on, I think we've seen something similar here in Brazil and also in Mexico. Now, the first thing to say is that viruses in general can't sustain for very long inside a body of water unless they've got a host to sort of cling to. And what we're seeing is the RNA and the proteins that are specific to the COVID virus that are being what's monitored. Now, I know we've touched on this a few times before. That is that's an opportunity here. The RNA doesn't mean infectious. The RNA means that it's you can detect that the virus is there, and of course this offers enormous potential for us to potentially find a way of using monitoring of wastewater to see whether there is the virus present in a particular community, and therefore you can then apply lockdown procedures or not to that community. We can go to the next slide. There's further data on this, which has come, and this was first picked up actually 4 weeks ago, was when we first picked up, and it was reshared this week, the not yet peer-reviewed report, which was around the study that was done in the Netherlands, which actually showed that these RNA samples were surviving. Off the back of that, we have been helping facilitate discussions between KWR, the people in the Netherlands who did that first research, and Tasmania Water down in Australia to see if there's something that can be done around an at-scale trial, because it would be really good to try and get some good feedback on that, because I think this we've got to make sure we fully understand what is happening to COVID-19 in the water network, whether it's the drinking water, the wastewater, the raw water, or the non-potable water network. So those were the 4 main questions that came through. Oh, sorry, and on that matter, because this is such a hot area, we've actually included here some global studies on COVID-19 in wastewater. So it's worth sort of, if this is an area that's relevant to you, please feel free to dip into those resources. In the interest of time, we'll move on. And I'd just like to touch on 2 other things here. Sorry, because I haven't got the slides in front of me, I don't know what the next slide is. There were some other comments around chloramines being used as a disinfectant, and also stuff on the shortage of PPEs. And I've captured them here. I won't repeat them again, but these were sort of the next tier of things that people were thinking about. It's interesting that actually the conversation about PPE has slowed down over the last week. It feels like people have either got on top of it or have worked out what they're doing. We launched a survey last week just to see how people were doing. We had pretty good response. You can see from this map, there's good response from around the world. If you flick to the next slide. And the summary of it was basically saying, well, what are the things you're finding easy to deal with? What are the things you're finding hard to deal with? And if you look here, the challenges and strengths, they will probably resonate with you. Yeah, first of all, on the challenges, it's risk of burnout. It's how do we maintain staff morale when we've got to do all the social distancing? How do we make sure that we've got payment and money collection is coming in, even though our water resources, even though there's a change in how much water we're supplying? And what are we doing with our infrastructure projects? Do we freeze all infrastructure projects or do we keep them going? On the positive side, I think there were two things here that stuck out. One is around, oh, I've got music playing in my ear. I don't know where it else is. Charlotte, are you able to see where that's coming from? I just put it on mute. Can anyone else hear music, or is it just me? It's the voices in my head talking to me again. On the strength side, there were a couple of things which are of interest here. One is around people, what we've done on crisis management. So Cape Town, I'm sure they wouldn't ever want to repeat their drought experience from a couple of years ago, but they did note that actually having the drought experience has made them, given them the ability to respond much more quickly on this. And I think a number of the US utilities said the same around their hurricane and disaster planning. And obviously the thing we've all seen here is it's unprecedented, the amount of team commitment that's coming. This is really sorting out the people in your teams who are prepared to go the extra mile, which is good to see. We go to the next slide in terms of, well, where do we think the solutions are? Interestingly, they basically split into four. So if you lump together technology solutions and R&D in one, you can see that there's sort of the solutions that people think are going to come either come from technology, or they come from exchanging best practice, which is a lot of what this group is about doing, or they come from changing operational procedures. So we think that we can adapt to this by just functional changes. And then people think that there's going to be quite a lot of solutions that will come from training. And obviously that training needs to be done online. The chief executive of Cape Town Water shared some specific ideas around focus groups. So they were making the point, this is on the text box there, they were making the point that actually the rapid learning, what we really need is the creation of some specific focus groups on different topics, or maybe even utilities of similar ilk. So it might be developing country utilities or utilities of particular sizes. And as we've now reached the limit on our WhatsApp group, so you may have seen that quite a few people are leaving the WhatsApp group. That's because we're asking organizations that have got representatives that are more than 2 people on it, we're actually asking them to cut down their numbers of people, just because we need to create space for more utilities. So we're trying to, there's a challenge for how do we create this, how do we keep this forum alive and delivering the benefit it needs to do, which might lead us to subgroups. So I'll come back to that on my last slide. If we go on, and then the last thing to touch on quickly is the technology outreach program. You'll recall that this was talked about last week and the week before. It's a program to try and find what might be the technologies that could solve this problem. The deadline for signing up to that was meant to be tomorrow, but I know that some utilities are going through the sign-off process, and so we've actually extended it for another couple of weeks, although we're hoping to start the project tomorrow. We've currently not quite got the number we wanted. We've got 13 utilities signed up from around the world. No US ones yet, though. And we've also got some funding coming in from UNESCO, the IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So it's an interesting project with some great minds behind it. The next slide touches on what's included in the project, which I won't talk about. So if you just want to click over that one quickly, it comes up piece by piece, I think. And then we'll come to the unanswered questions. So as always, there's a few questions here which run the risk of getting lost because there's so much going on the WhatsApp chat. Some of these questions get lost out. And that first one, are there utilities who have already prepared a checklist on what the operational protocols and guidelines are to implement after the lockdown? Which links to the comment I was making earlier around, well, what are we going to do in our exit? I think we're going to try and address some of those specific questions next week. And then there's a question around Italy and Spain, who are further through the pandemic. What can they share? And actually, if you go to the previous webinars, in particular, I think it was the second or maybe the third one, we included some issues around that. There is a question that comes up around stagnation in the network. And actually, if you go on, Charlotte, when we get to the references, so we include, as always, we include our list of references to other sources. And the one I'd like to draw your attention to here, there are two that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first one is this collaborative research initiative, which is being done by the Water Research Foundation. This looks like, if this is your bag, then this looks like it's going to be the brilliant thing to be. And it's a virtual international research summit on environmental surveillance of COVID indicators in sewer sheds. And it's launching on next Monday, with the findings being presented in the middle of next week. So, and there was a link there for you to go to if you wanted to join that. The other one to come to links to my comment I just made under those remaining questions. No, it's right, you can go on, which is around stagnation of water. And there's some documents here that we've put in which give you, what about how do you go about reopening buildings, and with a focus on Legionella, which hopefully provides, it doesn't quite provide the answer, but it provides some insight there that could be useful. So I appreciate that was a bit of a gallop. I worry slightly that everyone's going to get very bored of hearing my voice, but I don't think there's any better way of doing this. And as I said at the beginning, I like world domination. So, and it starts with people hearing my voice. If you go to the very last slide, or the next slide, the next steps, as always, if you've got any of these topics that you want to go into in more detail, please email myself or Charlotte DeWitt. I'd ask 4 things of you this week, if you could. If you're going into the exiting of lockdown or having some thoughts about what you're doing to exit lockdown, it would be really useful if you could share it with us. It might not be appropriate for you to stick it onto WhatsApp, simply because WhatsApp's more made for phones than computers, so email it to us if you want. Secondly, if you've got a perspective on what the subgroups might be most useful for you, then please let us have that, and we'll factor that in. We'll probably make some recommendations next week. The survey that was presented earlier, it's still open. There's a link to the survey if you wanted to add your input into it. If we have sufficient, if we get more information, I might revisit it. And then finally, on the technology outreach proposal, if you wish to participate in that, it's $3,500 or £3,000. Then just let us know, and we'll work with you. The next webinar will be this time next week. We're going to continue doing these weekly until it looks like it makes sense to reduce them down. I'm not sure. I have absolutely no idea whether we'll be doing these every week for the next 2 years, or whether in 2 months' time we'll be down to doing it once a month. We're gauging it week by week. I hope that was useful. I'll pause briefly in case anyone's got anything they want to say. I'll have a quick look. I've just seen that we've got a bunch of comments there, so I'll just quickly pull those up. So for those of you who can't see the comments, I can see it says, Sean has said it would be great to know what, if any, comms companies are planning on doing in advance of the summer surge of water use. Brilliant question. We'll put that on the WhatsApp group as well. And I think there's some support there from Adrian Cronin. Excellent. The hero of the Cronin factor is also on here. So thank you for that. And Per Luigi, I'd like to share some information from Italy. They've made a research on wastewater in Milan and Rome, and they found RNA traces of SARS-2. So very similar to what we've seen with COVID. I'll just pause briefly if anyone wishes to raise anything.
This is Greg from Las Vegas. Are we getting any data out of Sweden? I'm kind of curious, since they haven't done any sort of lockdown, if we're getting any data from their water utilities or wastewater utilities as to what's going on.
Excellent. So we've got some Swedish clients in Isle. I don't know whether they're on the WhatsApp group, but we will take that as an action. I will talk personally with them and see if we can get a sense of what are they seeing, how are they responding, and I will feedback specifically on that. That is an excellent question. That's a data point we are looking, isn't it? What about the countries that have just gone, you know what? We're not bothered with any of the lockdown. We're just carrying on regardless. It'll be really interesting to see, how their things like what's their absentee rate inside the organisation, inside Gothenburg Water Company. brilliant question. Thanks, Greg, for that. We will. I'll pick that one up. With
We can't hear you
that,
anymore,
if there's
Piers.
nothing else,
Breaking.
can I just thank you all for your time? Hope that you all keep safe. We love you, and speak to you again in a week's time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Piers. Bye now.
I don't know what happened there. I don't know when I lost you. I was